Well, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Jennifer Scott to our community and this kind of conversation. Jennifer is the managing director of thought leadership at Ogilvy USA and has been with Ogilvy for a number of years in leadership roles in the PR practice. She was formerly a senior vice president at Edelman, actually president of the Edelman Intelligence Group, and senior vice president SS&K. She also, and we'll get into this a little bit, has a DPhil from Oxford, and we'll ask her some questions about that. And most importantly for me, and great pleasure to say that she's also a colleague of ours at NYU School of Professional Studies as an adjunct teaching in our master's program in PR and corporate communication. So welcome, Jennifer.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Michael.
So where are you, and where do we find you today in Zoomtopia?
Yes, you find me locked down in my apartment in Greenwich Village, which is very close to the NYU campus, you know, I'm very contented here. So that's where I'm beaming in from.
Fantastic, and you know, I do want to pick up a little bit. You know, I obviously have some partial interest in this, being a fellow grad of Oxford. You know, that path you took from political science and your DPhil, which is a highly rigorous but academic degree, into the world of PR, and where you find yourself today. So, you know, could you give us some sense, a little bit of that journey and how those two things sort of mesh in your mind?
Yes, well, I think when I think about the consistencies, my interest in politics was always based on a fascination with how political communications worked to motivate people. And I remember even in high school studying the rise of the National Socialists in Germany and looking at the role of Nazi propaganda in moving a people, you know, into something that seemed so radically different from what Germany had been before, and how communications leveraged conditions and were able to move people. So when I arrived at Oxford, I'd already majored in politics as an undergraduate, and I had actually majored in politics in South Africa during apartheid, and I was similarly fascinated at the role of communications in moving people ideologically, and how selective communications could fulfill such a powerful function in terms of getting people to believe things that, you know, they otherwise might not normally believe. And so I came to Oxford fired up about that kind of dynamic, and my doctoral thesis was really about an anti-apartheid organization in South Africa that was fascinating because they were a group of white women who were quite wealthy, who really sacrificed an enormous amount to fight against apartheid. And what I realized was that communications can be enormously powerful, but personal experience is utterly formative. And I watched how these women, through beginning to act politically, opened their hearts and opened their minds. And so when I finished my doctorate, I thought, you know, do I stay in academia, which I probably could have, and continue to sort of think about the things that fascinate me, or do I act? You know, do I go out into the world and see how that changes me? And I decided to act. And I've always, since a small child, wanted to come to America. I was fascinated by American culture. And so I decided to come here. And I oriented quite naturally into research and PR and communications, because it was about that interface between the conditions within which we live and how we interpret them and how we talk about them and how we make sense of them. And so I think I do politics every single day in my job, because those basic lessons matter. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it is really fascinating to think about the much broader role of communications, you know, within business life and within political life, obviously. You know, that is probably emerging as one of the core skills any business leader needs to have developed. and certainly one of the core sort of meta skills, if you want to think about it that way, that we hope our students graduate with, and it's beyond obviously, the technical skills of PR, but this sense of small p politically navigating in an organization. It also sounds like at some point you have sort of observed the dark side of PR, I guess, or the dark side of communications, perhaps. How that was used, not necessarily as a force for good. Any sense of what that sort of taught you, or what having sort of studied that side of the world, how did that influence your practice even today?
Yeah, I think it's profoundly influenced me and my practice. I think I come from, personally, I come from a place, quite a strong moral imperative, because I have seen communications in combination with conditions. It's never purely communications, it's always conditions as well. I've seen communications be used to close people's minds and to limit their options. And I think people are at their best when they are free to think as broadly as they can, to evolve their capacity as human beings. And so I'm very interested in communications that provides that kind of openness, that gives people options, that opens their minds. And in my professional life, I have observed that the most effective communications, the ones that work best for my clients, are the ones that open people's minds, the ones that people can receive as giving them other options, choices, ways of seeing themselves that they maybe really like and they want to pursue. So I think it's not just a moral imperative, it's also good business, and it's good communications to do it that way, because to the extent that you use communications for evil, as it were, to close people's minds, I know this for a fact, it doesn't last very long. It comes back to get you, whether you're a government or you're a company or you're an individual in a relationship, quite frankly. It holds true, so.
No, and I think that definition of a sort of more abundant, open view of communications is probably also what makes you a wonderful educator, because I think, that model, the old model of the sort of the sage from the stage, where we were talking at our students, is clearly been abandoned a long time ago. And I think we all discovered that the most robust and enriching educational environment is one in which we can engender those conversations that you were talking about, where you're allowing others to really discover their own voice, communicate in their own unique fashion, and not providing conditions, not putting boundaries on what's their self-expression. So it's sort of all ties together, Jennifer, while you're wonderful in the classroom too. So absolutely delighted. So maybe the sort of main topic of our conversation, and it's I guess you get the date. It's May 21st, 2020. Should anyone wish to note the record in the future. And we're probably 8 weeks or so into this, horrific, at some level, crisis with COVID and coronavirus, and between 90 and 100,000 deaths in the US, and obviously many more sick around the world. And many of us have had lots of opportunities to sort of reflect. And we wanted to talk, if we could, a bit about sort of marketing and communications and leadership at a time of COVID-19. So, and one of the questions I've been asking folks on this series is really looking back a little bit first, and trying to see if there are some lessons that we can glean from the past. Many folks have said, I think reasonably, that this is a quite a unique situation. Unprecedented, probably an overworked word, but it does seem to me, whether we have to go as far back as the 1918 Spanish influenza, or whether it's more recent events like AIDS and SARS and the crash and Sandy or whatever. There's some learning, and you've lived through a lot of this recent history, and obviously drawn some lessons. So, any thoughts about what we might learn from history about how to respond, or what happens later?
Yeah, I do actually. So, in my profession, which is primarily public relations and corporate communications, we're always maybe too leery of looking back at precedent, because effectiveness in my sphere often really hinges on being very appropriate to the moment, to the audience, to the conditions, to the context, and it's sort of true that nothing is ever replicated, right? So from a point of view of a public relations professional, I'm always a little cautious about precedent. Having said that, I do think that in terms of fundamentals, there are two moments in history, particularly in the history of the United States, that are helpful here. And the first, which I think speaks to like the moment we're in right now, is for me actually 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you why, because 9/11 came out, for Americans, came out almost literally from a clear blue sky. It was utterly unexpected. It was perceived as an external attack, literally an act of war, but something came from outside. We didn't make it, right? And it was perceived, certainly in the first few weeks after it happened, as life-threatening. There was a sense of we didn't know when the next thing was going to happen. And, what it also triggered was massive and very quick behavior change. I think about New York City just shutting down every means of exit or entrance onto Manhattan. You couldn't leave the island.
Right.
And I think it was also a great equalizer. We all became Americans under threat in that moment. And I think those parallels, while not exact with what we're going through now, are quite instructive.
Right.
Because what it evoked in us at the time was two things. One was altruism. And we see this when people face a crisis together. And, the examples of some of the heroism down at the Twin Towers or at the Pentagon, and especially on the plane, that was altruism at its most moving. But we saw it subsequently too. The best of humanity, the best of sort of self-sacrifice. And I think we've seen that in the immediate aftermath of this virus, particularly in New York City. Everybody's together, 7:00, everybody's cheering the essential workers. And so that I think is a dimension that's reflected now. I think the other dimension from 9/11 is that we naturally are looking to our leaders to lead. We're looking for leadership. Not from everyone, but the people who should lead, we're looking for it. And that leadership is about clarity of vision. It's about firmness. It's about excellent communications. It's about giving us the information we need. And so I think altruism and leadership in this moment, we saw the need for it after 9/11. We see it now from organizations, from political leaders, from corporations, and to the extent that they can in their own ways rise to that challenge again, they will succeed. To the extent that they can't, they might very well fail miserably because the stakes are high. So I think 9/11 for now. But I will say that we are rapidly moving out of the 9/11 situation into what I would characterize as a situation that looks more like 2008, the Great Recession, right? So prolonged austerity, economic stress, pain. And as we move into that phase, a whole different set of things start to happen that impact communications. For one thing, that altruism starts to diminish. A degree of divisiveness starts to come in. Things start to seem more like a zero-sum game. If I don't get it, you get it, I don't get it, kind of thing. And in a case like that, communications has to change, and it has to be a lot more agile, a lot more dealing with situations as they arise. Leadership has to still be there, but I think what we're seeing is a need for, in that phase now, for a sense of what are our values, how are we going to express them, what's our vision, how are we going to get through this together, an ability to communicate bad news, honestly, to be authentic. So as we make that toggle from like a 9/11 kind of situation to a 2008 situation, I think leaders and organizations and corporations have to be very careful how they calibrate that pivot and get that shift right.
Right. No, it's an interesting contrast, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the sort of leadership lessons coming out of 9/11 were seen as much in the political sphere, and we're all aware of Rudy Giuliani's role and others. You saw these extraordinary acts of political leadership, and then these acts of personal courage, that were very noted by firemen and policemen and all sorts of folks who rushed to help, etc. But less perhaps we saw less from sort of companies and corporations. That wasn't perhaps their moment to step up. And again, if the record shows differently, we should correct it. But certainly when you got to the recession, I think businesses had to think differently about how they communicated, and largely partly perhaps because some of those businesses, the financial services, for example, were seen as the source of the problem, which was, obviously quite different from the attacks of 9/11. And I guess there's some, parallels there as well, which is this crisis has drawn, this current crisis has probably drawn out of businesses a deeper need to respond and take a position on the issue, So what are you beginning to advise, or so you have been probably, how are you advising your clients today? I mean, you're in conversation with CCOs and other business growth leaders, clients more generally. What are sort of the top 3 or 4 things that you're, sharing with them or instructing them or guiding them to think about today?
Well, the first thing that we're making sure, and it seems surprising perhaps, but that they actually do something. So, there are companies who don't feel like they're on the front lines, who are like, we're just going to be quiet. We're going to kind of sit this one out, and you can't go dark. You just cannot, even if it's just a note on your website explaining, how you're with the first, you're with the essential, whatever it is, you cannot go quiet. Another version of that is that, a lot of our clients, and I completely understand this, are pulling right back on their marketing spend. What's the point of advertising a cruise when there aren't any cruises happening? But for them, what we're counseling is, yes, by all means, cut back, but don't go quiet, go silent, because the data from 2008, the data from, for many, many years has indicated that when the temptation is to go quiet and save your money, you are actually hemorrhaging reputation by being silent. So to be thoughtful about how you're present, but to continue to spend some marketing dollars, and also to look at your public relations opportunities and your earned media and your social media as ways of staying present, because simply doing nothing equals reputational decline. And I think a lot of clients aren't quite sure of that equation. So we talk to them about that. And second, I think that at the moment, as we've discussed, these themes of altruism and leadership, have to be expressed in what they're communicating, but also in what they're doing. I was so struck, Michael, there was the Edelman Trust Barometer, a special version that came out at the end of March, which showed that 71% of respondents said that if they perceived that a brand was putting profits before people, they would lose trust in that brand forever. So you can see how raw people are feeling about the behavior of corporations in this moment. And so, we're advising clients to be very sensitive to that, and appreciate this, the fact that people really want to see people being put first and family being put first, right? And by family, I mean the corporate or the organizational family. And so employees, absolutely. Treat your employees right. And then treat your customers right, and treat your partners right. Just as we naturally as human beings aggregate around our families at these moments and want to make sure everyone's taken care of, so we expect organizations and corporations to take care of their families too. There's no different.
Right.
And sort of woe betide you if you don't. We're seeing this with McDonald's right now. They're trying, but there's a strike today. There've been lawsuits against McDonald's frontline workers feeling like they're not protected enough. And it's right or wrong. It's just from a reputational optical point of view, it's very problematic. People are really not wanting to see this.
Right. No, and I think the work of the Edelman Trust Barometer, I think also for me was fascinating in the sense of how much kind of trust people put in the companies they work for. Trust that those companies will solve important societal problems ahead of the government and ahead of the more traditional, sort of charitable organizations and institutions that were involved in solving problems. And I think that so it must be particularly challenging for people who have put their level of trust into their employer or big companies generally, to see some of them acting badly, or to see them acting without that level of humanity.
Yes.
Yeah, and how should, I mean, it's a question I think for both CCOs and CMOs is about how to do some of that authentically. And there was early on, I mean, it's probably 3 or 4 weeks ago now, there was a mashup of all the various ads that brands had run, and it was a bit mischievous and unfair. But its suggestion was both the sea of sameness, which is a endemic problem to marketing, but also perhaps a little bit of lack of sincerity or virtue signaling, but I came away from that experience thinking, well, how would you do that better? I mean, what would you have done differently to see more authentic or real? Have you found some good sort of ways of guiding leaders to that place, or examples perhaps that you've seen you think people arrive there?
Yeah, actually we have. So firstly, my heart goes out to the people who got skewered by those kinds of mashups, because everybody's in crisis. It's not like these corporations are having a fine time. I mean, they're facing massive challenges themselves day to day, so I feel as if, we should cut them a little bit of slack. But having said that, what we are working with our clients on is we're encouraging them to, as you say, that action has to be meaningful. But more than that, we're encouraging them to be quite strategic, in the sense that we're saying, what is your current relationship with your target audiences, and what do they most need from you right now? And spending a little time to actually work that out. And often it's surprising, actually. Often it's not what they needed 4 months ago. And so locate that in a very diligent way. What do they need from you right now? And then look at what you can give them, and find that sweet spot between the two, and just focus on that. Because if you get the sweet spot right, you don't have to make a grand, massive, multi-million-dollar gesture to reach people in their hearts. So I've been actually, Michael, really impressed with Ford lately. I don't know if you've noticed some of their newest advertising, which is around, built Ford tough is like the classic identity. But Ford has always drawn its identity as being part of America, through wars, through previous depressions, through being there. And their new advertising is around built to lend a hand, built for right now. And it's got that classic brand identity of Ford, that toughness, that endurance, that we're at your side-ness, but it is being expressed in a way that is meaningful for right now. And so they've got their credit support program, where anybody who's paying off a Ford car or truck is being given relief for their payments. And so that's Ford, I think it's doing this brilliantly, which is, who are we at our heart? Who are we targeting, and what do they need from us right now, and delivering it? And I think their brand is just going to, it's going to locate itself in the hearts and minds of customers and potential customers in a way that it didn't exist before.
And I think to some extent that must be because they spent the time up front, well ahead of this crisis, in defining most of those things. Yes, I mean that real deep understanding of who they are, what do they stand for, you know, what do they mean in the mind of consumers, etc.
And they didn't do this.
That's the fault lines maybe that are showing up a little bit, is that, you know, that those brands who hadn't taken that time. I mean, I've also heard it expressed in the context of brands whose business models perhaps weren't as fully, you know, fleshed out or thought through, didn't have the sort of resilience to withstand some of the, you know, the shifts in spending. Obviously, in our world, a lot of the media-supported business, advertising-supported businesses, they don't have a dual income stream from subscriptions or something like that, are suffering, you know, much more distinctly, I think, than some other brands who had diversified their revenue. But how much does this tie in your mind to this question of purpose? You know, so if you roll back the clock, you know, and then there's various you know, pundits who will tell you how far you have to roll that clock back. But you know, there are this, certainly post Milton Friedman, you know, there's been a discussion around topics like stakeholder capitalism and you know, the work of, or compassionate capitalism, it's been called, and obviously the Davos gathering, I think, has talked about this for several years, and then it was re-emphasized and re-amplified with Larry Fink's letter, and then in the Business Roundtable. So this issue of purpose and putting purpose at a more central place in the design of businesses, I think, you know, that being, to me, the more important takeaway, rather than purpose as sort of an artifact or of an affect or something, but really is at the center of the design. How you know, where were we right before this happened, and how do you think it's held up? You know, the companies that were sort of the prophets of purpose, how have they held up?
Well, you know, I do think that purpose was in a very interesting place before this happened. It was sort of, it was experiencing, I think, a new kind of purpose was experiencing almost birth pains. We were seeing bits of it, and then we were seeing other bits that weren't quite evolved in different companies. And for me, one of the biggest and most interesting signals was the street. So this notion of ESG investing, right? Investing for environment, social, and governance. And the fact that this had begun to get quite a lot of currency among big investment houses, I thought was a signal that even on the street, which is classically cared about shareholder value, you know, and they've cared about products and services to the extent that they drive shareholder value, to start to look at companies in a bigger sense about what their impact on the environment was, what their impact on society was, how they were articulating governance in the broadest sense of the word. So I thought it was heading in that direction already. And there were some companies that were very much showing us the way. You know, I do think Unilever, from a strategic point of view, realized this very early, that their mission had to, well, they wanted their mission to incorporate not just, you know, making money for shareholders and delivering excellent products and services, but to incorporate a sense of what they wanted the world to look like, and to express that in what they did. And I suspect this virus, the pandemic, and I think the economic consequences of this pandemic are going to challenge companies and organizations to be a lot more deliberate about how they integrate purpose. It's going to be fraught, Michael. I think it's going to be quite fraught, because under pressure, you're not the best person you can be often, right?
Yeah.
Or the best organization.
Yeah, that's always been the test for me. I think, I've spent sort of more time perhaps thinking about strategy more broadly than purpose specifically, but the same rules seem to apply that, the test of how committed a company is to their strategy is whether they would do it, how they behave in the worst of times,
Mhm.
and or whether they would be willing to follow a strategy, a long-term strategy, if it meant some short-term losses, financial losses,
Right.
and that seemed to me a measure of it. And I think there have been critics of companies that were signatories to the Business Roundtable who haven't necessarily acted with respect to their employees in ways that would be consistent with, I think the full mission of this sort of purpose-driven view of the world. And maybe they'll all get I think what they call in the States a hall pass, for that, because it is quite unprecedented times. There's no playbook. All these kind of truisms we've been sharing with each other. That it's that nobody quite knew how to react. But I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued to see how companies will emerge again, especially in the context that you described about how employees judge them, which is arguably one of the more obvious positive aspects of purpose is giving your employees a stronger sense of belonging and identity. But one will be interested to see whether these companies that perhaps didn't fare so well in terms of how they treated employees will still be able to take a position on being purpose driven.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And I also am intrigued to see the degree to which consumers will start to push back on these companies, because you're right, under pressure, if a company has to choose between doing well and doing good, and they
Yeah,
can't have both, which way do they
correct.
go? But at the same time, consumers are starting to, and I think as consumers go through a prolonged period of economic difficulty at best, they're going to have a more critical eye towards
Mm,
companies and the way companies are integrating justice into their supply chains, for example.
right.
We see these supply chains breaking down. Suddenly, who knew? A meatpacking plant in Iowa accounted for a
Mm,
huge percentage of what we eat, meat we eat, and how are those people being treated? So I think in some ways this event and the subsequent economic fallout is gonna take the veil off a lot of stuff that
mm.
had been veiled in terms of how these companies operated for consumers.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that's going to be a spur to evolving a purpose that is a lot more substantive than maybe they would normally
Mm,
be motivated to do. I saw the president and COO of JetBlue, Joanna Gertie, said she issued a video this week where, JetBlue, she's talking about how they're trying to make sure flying is safe once people are ready to fly again, that all the precautions they're taking, etc. But what she said that struck me in particular was, she said, we want to make travel more humane. We
mm,
believe in making travel more humane. Now, that's a pre-pandemic pain point. That's not about cleaning your plane. And that's JetBlue putting a purpose on the table that is a huge call out to the industry, because anybody who's traveled, especially domestically, over the last 5 years knows it is not a humane experience. So I'm wondering from a competitive point of view too, how companies like JetBlue are looking ahead and saying, what's our advantage in terms of having a purpose like that that's really going to resonate? And is it worth the extra cost it's going to be to make flying more humane? So I'm excited. I
yeah.
mean, it's going to be interesting.
No, I like that phrase, a pre-pandemic pain point, because I want to segue a little bit perhaps into what the future might hold and what we've learned. And certainly one of the tropes today is, maybe not a lot has changed, but it's accelerated things that were already happening. And I think that fits neatly with your idea of pre-pandemic pain points, so to the extent that those existed already, the experience of living through COVID and the lockdown and sheltering in place, etc., has forced us to look at some of those pain points differently, and or has caused us to accelerate the implementation of things we were talking about, didn't think we could get done, etc. So it's an unfair question to ask, because I almost think it's impossible to answer. But the question I've been trying to ask people is, what do we think has fundamentally changed about human behavior? And given that, we would all probably say that human behavior doesn't change that dramatically or rapidly. What then might be some of the key trends we should be thinking about or looking at that you would want, to pay attention to, has taken your attention, and you'd say, that's the things we probably want to understand how that plays out.
Yeah. So I think, when anybody asks how has human behavior perhaps changed, I'm I think more with you in the belief that human behavior does not fundamentally change that dramatically, but I do think circumstances change and evoke different kinds of behaviors, and I think social norms change, and those can have a long-term impact on how we behave as human beings. And so it's important to recognize that, we don't go through things, even very traumatic things, as a group and necessarily come out forever changed. But we do come out with new potentials that if they're evoked and if they're steered and if the circumstances are right, we can build a new world, as they would say in Disney. Mm-hmm. So, I think that a few trends that are just interesting to me, one is somewhat frivolous, but I thought I'd mention it because I think it's a little bit provocative, and one is actually quite substantive. The first is, I'm really fascinated to observe what's happening to celebrities right now. Mm-hmm. They're not having a good pandemic, celebrities. I mean, they're just doing what celebrities do. Right? What they know works, which is that they're exposing us to their fantastic lifestyles, even in lockdown. And the smack back from, social media and everybody with a Twitter handle has been profound in some ways. So, I think of Madonna not resonating very well in social media. I think of J-Lo, and others who, and I thought, what's going on here? And does this signify a seismic change in our relationship to celebrities? Because, clients, I have spent a lot of money on celebrities to endorse their products, to, be representative. And I don't know what the fallout's going to be, Michael, but I think that what makes celebrities work is that they show us a glimpse of, in a way, what we think we could be possibly. We get to vicariously live it through them. We see us in them.
Right.
But, and because it's all fantasy, right? They're beautiful and wealthy and successful, but we can see ourselves in them. The minute that falls apart, it breaks apart, and we can no longer see ourselves in them. We can no longer see ourselves in lockdown like Madonna or like J-Lo. Then we have a problem. And so I'm talking to my clients in particular about just keeping an eye on the Instagram influencers that they might be using, or even the big celebrities they might be paying money for. Let's see what happens. Maybe people like Anthony Hopkins, who's playing piano for his cat, and Dame Judi Dench, who's answering her grandson's joke questions. Those are the ones who are working, right? So will celebrity change? I don't know, but maybe it will.
Fascinating.
And I think the other one, sorry, go ahead.
No, I love that. I haven't really thought about it in that context, but because I think you've also got some, examples of celebrities who have really been quite humanizing. I'm thinking of is it John Krasinski and the what's he calling it, SNL or something good TV, SGTV or something, where he's really, it seems to me at least, he's trying to sort of represent, we're all going through this together, and we can have a bit of humor and humanity about it. So
yeah, exactly. I think the celebrities who are succeeding as people, as humans, are working. The celebrities who are simply trying to represent an aspirational lifestyle, it's pulled apart. So we'll see how, maybe it'll all
snap
back. I don't know. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and you've probably heard this before and thought about it yourself at length, is the notion of climate change. and global warming, because, you know, personally, I think that the coronavirus pandemic is simply a shot across the bows of humanity, and that the battle is going to be global warming and climate change.
Mm.
And I think that the experience of this virus for all of us, and this is where I think human nature can change, we have suddenly seen how small the planet is, how vulnerable the planet is, how something can happen at a planetary level, which can be life-threatening. And I think that experience applied to climate change going forward will make climate change a lot more visceral for a lot more people and a lot more scary. And I think that is going to demand that companies and organizations really get their house in order around what is their role in climate change, how are they communicating about it, how are they trying to address it in their own footprint, but also bigger than their own footprint. And I was really fascinated to see that there's currently a group of companies, including some really big companies like Colgate-Palmolive, Unilever, Nestle, who have come together to create the not too well named Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is basically an attempt to get governments to focus on a climate-oriented recovery. So we've got to recover from this pandemic. Are we going to recover in a climate-oriented way, or are we not? And the fact that these big companies have already pivoted into this space, it aligns with purpose a little bit. It says that they believe that on this next existential threat to humanity coming down the road that we can see at least, which is climate change, I think they're betting that human nature is going to change. Triggered by the virus. So we'll see, but I'm not taking my eye off that. And I'm strongly advising all my clients to not take their eye off that.
Right. Yeah, I think in the mix there somehow is this question of how much we rely on expert opinion and science, you know, and I think the jury seems very much out. At some level, it strikes me that many of us have had a bit of a wake-up call to say, you know what, perhaps we need to listen to those scientists, or, you know, perhaps their advice is you know, the sort of rational sound advice is something that could save our lives, frankly. But you clearly have a large portion of, you know, America and the UK and indeed the political leaders of those countries who have chosen to ignore or, you know, eschew the more scientific advice. And so and they have their supporters. So one wonders, you know, obviously that's germane to discussion around the climate, because the same issues were dogging the you know, notwithstanding the fact that the documented scientific evidence in support of climate change and the impact of, you know, human activity on climate change is overwhelming, that still is a source of doubt or question or rhetoric, or at minimum hasn't been powerful enough to help us, you know, take action. And so I'm curious to see what happened, you know, how we perceive you know, scientists or the experts more generally moving forward. You know, are they to be trusted, or are they the ones, you know, some people would argue their conservatism in this pandemic may have saved our lives, but, you know, has caused challenges to the economy, etc. You know, what will be really interesting to see how that nets out. What do you think we've learned about ourselves as humans, you know, or as colleagues even, or you know, just the word humanizing I've heard used a lot recently in various conferences and different forums. You know, as we're seeing each other's, you know, the dog or the cat wanders by, or the kids are screaming in the background, or whatever it is, you know, or the more, you know, positive aspects that, you know, of the individual acts of grace and kindness. You know, what have we learned, you think, about ourselves as humans, and how might that translate in the workplace or you know, in corporate culture, for example?
Yeah, it's such a lovely question. You know, I think that people who've said that, you know, we humanized is a good word. I think that I've always been very interested in the perspectives, broadly speaking, of different generations. And one of the things pre-pandemic that we always said, particularly about the younger millennials and the Gen Zs, is that the divide between work and life is non-existent, you know, and that led to, you know, older Xers like me getting all crusty at work about things, you know, about wanting the boundaries. And I think that this pandemic, and as you say, you know, everybody can see our book collections and our cats and hear our kids running around. I think that it's accelerated the perspective of that younger generation and allowed it to kind of break over older generations who are still working, and kind of given permission to people like me to chill out, you know, in a way that I think is actually going to facilitate our capacity to work together, our capacity to be more fluid.
Right.
You know, I think that I've always believed that, you know, we're our own worst enemies in terms of the restrictions we place on our own minds and our own behaviors and our own emotions. And I think that this experience has been one of being in the trenches, of being exposed in some ways professionally that we wouldn't have been exposed before. I mean, our hair is growing. We can't even get a haircut. Okay. So I think it's good. I think there's a permissiveness about what's happened, which is in the best possible way, a permissiveness to think, to speak, to express, to riff on things, to take chances, to not be confined by structures in the workplace that I'm hoping really takes flight, you know.
Right.
And honestly, you know, elasticized waists are the great equalizer. You know, we're all wearing them, so it means that the kind of you know, my position as a managing director feels a
Right.
little less imposing right now, and that's good. You know, so that's my take on it.
No, I think that's a wonderful thought. I heard someone say, you know, yesterday in a similar context, he was talking about, he said, vision is singular, but leadership is plural. And I like the idea of how, you know, just everyone popping up on the screen, each in his or own square, in some senses is a leveler. You know, I mean, clearly some of us have nicer homes behind us or in, you know, tonier neighborhoods or what have you, but there is a sort of leveler to that experience. There's a sort of hierarchy that got broken, I think, by these Zoom meetings. And yeah, no, I think that's a really, it is I think it's a decent thing to say there's been a humanizing. And I think if we look at, you know, most, yeah, it's not my expertise, but, you know, much of the literature about, you know, groups of people that live through some kind of, you know, trauma or challenging experiences, there is a clear bonding, you know, there's a clear esprit de corps that develops from that, you know, and some of the, you know, most dramatic are things like the experience of the First World War, which arguably was a cause of a breakdown in the social structure in the UK. You know, it was a little hard to maintain those kind of, or at least the same level of, you know, these different elites when you'd all fought shoulder to shoulder in the war. But no, it would be a very powerful thing to think that, you know, this had helped humanize or flatten the corporations. I've heard folks say, Javier Meza, we were chatting to from Coke, who's the global CMO of the Coke brand, and he was talking about how much, in some sense, how much easier it was to collaborate globally across the company, and not so much that it had been difficult before, but just, you know, people were just incredibly focused, very oriented towards collaborating. Ideas that otherwise would have gone through multiple stages of approval, et cetera, just sort of happened and engaged. And I think we're all finding that very rewarding. You know, and to your point, we haven't really lost positional power necessarily. We just we feel we're working on something positive. Like, you know, it'd be wonderful to see that continue.
Yeah.
Maybe we just finish up. We, you know, probably a decent part of our audience will be students, you know, at NYU and elsewhere. And I wonder if you had any thoughts, you know, to share with students about navigating or entering into, you know, a workplace and a future career at a time of you know, of obviously massive unemployment and quite challenging times, especially in our industries in communications and marketing and advertising and PR, etc. And any thoughts to share, you know, about navigating the future or how to best position yourself, or what we can do to sharpen our skills.
Yes, it is a tough one. Let's not underestimate. You know, it's a tough time to be entering into the workplace. My early feelings and thoughts about this are a little bit about the fact that small and local can be very powerful coming out of this. And so, you know, classically the aspiration was, you know, to land a job at a big recognized company or a big agency, you know, like the one I work for. And that, I think, as a trajectory has really been disrupted by this pandemic. It was already being disrupted, but it's being disrupted. And so and just as you say, the hierarchy is being disrupted. The hierarchy of ideas, the hierarchy of activation is being disrupted. So I think I would encourage students to look broadly and look for energy, look for innovation, look for ingenuity, and look local as well as big, because I think we're going to see, you know, a lot of people have been furloughed and laid off from the big companies. And so I think what we're going to see is a lot of flowers blooming in this industry in particular, and some of them will really flourish. And so don't be afraid to start small and get scrappy. Hook yourself onto somebody who has a lot of experience, but who may, for some reason, have wanting to start their own gig or work for a smaller company. I think that's something to look out for. You know, and I think stay curious, because everything is changing. Right. And, you know, people like me who used to have some claim to having kind of wisdom, this is a whole new world, you know, and I can take my old wisdom and try and apply it, but the game has changed and it's never going to be the same. And so you as somebody coming into the business has a perspective on the game that I personally find enormously valuable. And so I'm going to be listening to you in a way I might not have listened to you prior to the pandemic, you know, and that's great news. So don't be afraid to speak. Don't be afraid to bring your experience and your thoughts about what's going on now to the table.
Fantastic. Well, that's a lovely place to close. This idea of finding your inner wisdom and that, you know, it is of value in the marketplace still. I think that's a really important lesson for all of us. So anyway, on behalf of the School of Professional Studies and our integrated marketing and communications programs, I want to thank you sincerely. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. I look forward to seeing you hopefully soon back in the classroom, but wherever we encounter each other, it's always a great pleasure. So many thanks for joining us today.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much, Michael. Take good care.